If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit. Marco Rubio, U.S. Secretary of State, January 3rd, 2026. I think Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now. Donald Trump, January 3rd, 2026. That was Marco Rubio, the United States Secretary of State, speaking hours after American Special Forces extracted Nicolas Maduro from his compound in Caracas. The man who ruled Venezuela for 11 years is now sitting in a federal detention center in New York, facing narco-terrorism charges that carry a life sentence. Donald Trump announced the United States will run Venezuela during a transition period. American oil companies are already mobilizing to develop the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. And 90 miles from Florida, in Havana, the lights that were already flickering may be about to go out for good. Because here's what most people don't understand about Cuba. For 25 years, Venezuela was Cuba's life support machine. At its peak, Venezuelan support was worth $16 billion annually. That's 22% of Cuba's entire economy. Let that sink in. That's more than the Soviet Union ever provided, in nominal terms. But that lifeline had already been hemorrhaging. Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba collapsed 75% before Maduro was even captured. The regime was already drowning. Now the last thread has been cut. The question isn't whether Cuba faces a crisis. The question is whether the 67-year-old revolution can survive what comes next. This video will show you how an oil for doctors deal kept a communist regime alive for a quarter century. We'll look at the dirty secret behind Cuba's famous medical diplomacy. We'll examine why every survival strategy from the 1990s has already been exhausted, and we'll answer the question everyone from Washington to Havana is asking: is this the final chapter of the Cuban Revolution? To understand why Cuba is in freefall, you need to understand the deal that kept them alive. And it wasn't charity. It was one of the most cynical economic arrangements in modern history. Picture Cuba in the year 2000. A decade after the Soviet collapse, and the island is still bleeding. GDP is down 35% from 1989. The ration books are getting thinner. The blackouts are getting longer. The revolution is running on fumes. Then along comes Hugo Chavez, a young Venezuelan officer who just won the presidency on a wave of socialist populism. And he has a hero, an idol, a man he's been dreaming about since he was a teenager reading revolutionary pamphlets. Fidel Castro, December 2000. The two men signed something called the Convenio Integral de Cooperación, the Comprehensive Cooperation Agreement, the pitch to the world: socialist solidarity, two revolutionary nations helping each other through hard times. The reality: a desperate deal between a dying regime and a rising strongman with money to burn. Here's how the deal actually worked. Think of it as a barter system between two regimes that didn't trust banks. Venezuela sends tankers full of oil, 100,000 barrels, every single day. Cuba doesn't pay cash, they don't have any. Instead, they pay in people, doctors, nurses, physical therapists, sports trainers, teachers, and quietly, in the background, intelligence advisors. Venezuela valued each Cuban professional at about $5,000 per month. Multiply that by 30 to 40,000 professionals deployed at the peak, and you get a number that should make you pause. $16 billion annually. Now, for context, Cuba's entire economy is about $70 billion. This one deal represented 22% of everything Cuba produced, earned, and consumed. And here's the part that surprises most people. The Soviet Union, the superpower that propped up Cuba for 3 decades, never provided this much. In nominal dollar terms, Hugo Chavez gave Fidel Castro more than Brezhnev and Gorbachev combined. Now, Cuba's medical diplomacy has great PR. 60,000 healthcare workers in 67 countries. After earthquakes, during pandemics, Cuban doctors show up. Sounds heroic. But let me show you what's happening behind the white coats. A Cuban doctor in Venezuela earns $5,000 a month on paper. That's what Venezuela pays to Cuba. But the doctor doesn't see that money. The Cuban government takes its cut first. 70%, sometimes 90%. Take-home pay for a trained physician working overseas, $250 to $400 per month. Their passports? Confiscated by Cuban officials on arrival. Their movements? Monitored. Their families back home? Leverage to ensure compliance. Thousands have defected anyway. Walked away from the program, sought asylum in the countries they were sent to serve, chose permanent exile over returning to Cuba. The UN has a term for work arrangements where people can't leave, don't keep their wages, and face retaliation against their families. Forced labor, socialist solidarity, where the workers don't get to keep what they earn. But Cuba didn't just send doctors, they sent something far more valuable to a dictator trying to consolidate power. They sent intelligence operatives, security advisors, the people who helped Chavez and then Maduro build their surveillance apparatus, their secret police, their systems of control. When Marco Rubio says Venezuelan security services were full of Cubans, when he says Venezuela was colonized by Cuba from a security standpoint, he's not exaggerating. This wasn't foreign aid. It was a franchise agreement for authoritarianism. Cuba exported the technology of repression in exchange for the oil that kept the revolution alive. And here's the trap Cuba built for itself. 80% of Cuba's electricity comes from burning oil. Domestic production, about 40,000 barrels a day. They need 110 to 120,000 just to keep the lights on. 70% of Cuba's food is imported, paid for with the money from exported doctors and Venezuelan subsidies. When Venezuela started collapsing, when the oil shipments started shrinking, Cuba didn't have a plan B. They didn't have alternative suppliers. They didn't have domestic capacity. They had a 25-year addiction to Venezuelan oil. And now the dealer is in federal custody. So Cuba survived the Soviet collapse. They built a new lifeline, became utterly dependent on it. Which raises the obvious question, and if they survived losing the Soviets, why can't they survive losing Venezuela? Let me show you exactly why this time is different. December 26, 1991. The Soviet flag comes down over the Kremlin for the last time. The USSR ceases to exist, and 8,000 miles away, Cuba wakes up to find that $4.3 billion in annual subsidies has vanished overnight. No warning, no transition period, just gone. What followed became known as the Periodo Especial en Tiempo de Paz, the special period in time of peace. Cubans just call it the special period. It's the polite name for what happens when a communist economy loses a fifth of its GDP in 1 year. The phrase GDP contracted 35% doesn't mean anything until you see what it looks like in a kitchen, in a hospital, on a street. Let me make it human. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds during the special period, not from dieting, from not having enough food. Caloric intake dropped from 2,900 calories a day, normal, to 1,863. That's permanent hunger every day for years. And then the blindness started. 50,862 people developed optic neuropathy, a disease caused by vitamin B deficiency. They lost their vision because the country couldn't afford vitamins. Think about that. A nation of doctors, famous for healthcare, watching tens of thousands of its citizens go blind from malnutrition. The blackouts lasted 16 to 20 hours a day. Imagine getting 4 hours of electricity, maybe, if you were lucky. The government imported 700,000 Chinese bicycles because there was no gasoline for cars. They welded truck trailers onto bus chassis, Cubans called them camels, and packed hundreds of commuters into converted freight containers. In the summer heat? No air conditioning? Because there was no fuel. That was survival in the 1990s. So how did the regime survive? Tourism. Cuba went from 340,000 visitors in 1990 to 1.6 million by 1999. Foreigners in beach resorts while Cubans went hungry. Remittances. They legalized dollar holdings and let Cuban exiles in Miami send money home. Limited market reforms. Small restaurants called paladeas. Farmers' markets. Self-employment in 150 occupations. And one more thing, maybe the most important thing. The revolutionary generation was still alive, still believing, still willing to sacrifice for the cause. So Cuba survived, barely. With starvation and blindness and bicycles, can they do it again? Every survival strategy from the 1990s has either been exhausted or reversed. Let me show you. Population age. In the 1990s, Cuba's median age was 28, young workforce. Today, 42.2, the oldest population in the Americas. Old people don't start revolutions, but they also can't rebuild economies. Tourism. In 1990, Cuba had untapped potential. By 1999, 1.6 million visitors. That growth saved them. Today, tourism already peaked and it's declining. Hotel occupancy is at 24%. You can't grow what's already tapped out. Remittances. Legalizing dollar remittances in the 1990s opened a new money pipeline. Today, that pipeline is maxed out, and under US sanctions, there's no new remittance boom coming. Revolutionary believers. In the 1990s, the generation that fought at the Bay of Pigs, that faced down the missile crisis, they were still alive, still true believers. Today, they're dead or in nursing homes. Their grandchildren have seen the world on social media. They know what they're missing: emigration. In the 1990s, leaving Cuba was hard. Today, more than 10% of the population has fled in 4 years. 1 million people. And they're not the old or the sick. They're the young, the skilled, the doctors Cuba trained and exported. Every single metric is worse. The playbook from the 1990s doesn't work when every page has already been used. But here's the thing that really seals it. Everything I just showed you about Cuba's crisis, all of those statistics about why this time is worse, that was before Maduro fell. Let me show you what was already happening when that phone call came from Caracas. The Venezuelan Lifeline didn't break on January 3, 2026. It had been hemorrhaging for years. Peak shipments, 100,000 to 115,000 barrels per day. 2025 average, 27,000 barrels per day. That's a 75% collapse before the capture. June 2025, they hit a low of 8,000 barrels per day. Cuba's oil imports overall dropped 35% in the first 10 months of 2025 compared to the year before. The $16 billion lifeline? It had already shrunk to a fraction. Venezuela couldn't save Cuba because Venezuela couldn't save itself. October 18, 2024. The Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant fails. Then another plant trips offline. Then another. The cascade begins. For the first time since the Soviet collapse, total nationwide blackout. All 10 million Cubans in the dark at the same time. The grid didn't just fail once, it collapsed twice more in the following days as engineers tried to restore power. 3 complete system failures in 1 week. By late 2024, daily deficits exceeded 1,600 megawatts. Many provinces were receiving only 2 to 4 hours of electricity daily. Some areas, 20-hour blackouts as the new normal. The Food Monitor program surveyed Cuban households in 2024. Here's what they found. 7 out of 10 Cubans have stopped eating at least one meal every day, just skipping meals because there's no food. 88% extreme poverty rate, according to the Cuban Observatory of Human Rights. Average monthly salary, 4,560 Cuban pesos. At the black market exchange rate, that's $14.70 per month. Cost of a basic monthly food basket, 20,000 pesos. The math is literally impossible. You cannot survive on what Cuba pays. The 2024 sugar harvest brought in 165,000 metric tons. For context, Cuba produced 8 million tons in the 1980s. The island, once famous for sugar, can barely grow any. The Food Monitor program put it this way: hunger not only deteriorates bodies, It also breaks bonds, dissolves life projects, and erodes public trust in the state. Want to understand just how broken Cuba's economy really is? Ask a simple question. What is the Cuban peso worth? The Cuban government has three different answers, simultaneously. If you're the government doing official transactions, 24 pesos equal $1. If you're a regular Cuban citizen at a state exchange, 120 pesos per dollar. If you're on the street, where actual economic reality happens, 387 pesos per dollar. The gap between what the government claims and what the market believes is 88%. That's not an exchange rate. That's a government lying about the value of its own money. When a currency loses credibility this completely, people stop using it. Cubans hoard dollars, euros, anything but pesos. The national currency has become a fiction. And then there's the exodus. Since 2021, more than 1 million Cubans have fled the island. That's over 10% of the entire population in 4 years. To put that in perspective, the famous Mariel boat lift in 1980 that everyone remembers, that was 125,000 people. The 2021 to 2024 exodus to the United States alone, 860,000. Cuba's population dropped from 11.3 million in 2020 to somewhere between 8.6 and 9.7 million today. The route? Visa-free flights from Havana to Managua, Nicaragua. Then overland through Central America to the US border. Cost $8,000 to $10,000 per person. Nicaragua collected $66 million in visa fees from Cubans in just the first 10 months of 2023. And here's the demographic death spiral. In 2024, Cuba recorded 71,374 births versus 130,645 deaths. Nearly 2 deaths for every birth. The people leaving are aged 20 to 40, peak productive years, peak reproductive years. Cuba lost 46,000 healthcare workers between 2021 and 2022, including more than 12,000 doctors. The medical system that was Cuba's pride, the export product that funded the regime, it's gutted. March 2024. Protests erupt in Santiago de Cuba. Now that might not mean much to you, but Santiago wasn't just any city. Santiago was the birthplace of the revolution. July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro launched his movement from Santiago with an attack on the Moncada barracks. And now, 70 years later, residents of that same city are in the streets shouting, "We are hungry and we have no electricity." When the cradle of the revolution protests the revolution, the symbolism writes itself. So Cuba was already drowning, the Venezuelan lifeline was sputtering, the lights were going out, the people were fleeing, the birthplace of the revolution was demanding food. But Maduro was still there, still sending something, still representing hope that maybe the oil would flow again. Then came July 28, 2024, the day Venezuelans tried to vote their way to freedom. The Venezuelan opposition holds a primary. The winner, Maria Corina Machado, with 93% of the vote. She's a firebrand. An economist educated at Yale who's been fighting the regime for 20 years. She promises to end 21st century socialism and restore Venezuela. The regime's response? They disqualify her from running. Just like that. The woman who won 93% of the opposition vote, banned from the ballot. Enter Edmundo González Urrutia. He's 75 years old, a retired diplomat. He was literally enjoying his retirement when the opposition called. They needed a placeholder, someone to fill the ballot line, someone the regime wouldn't take seriously. González became the unity candidate. The Cincinnatus figure called from private life to serve his country when no one else could. The regime thought he was a joke. They were wrong. July 28, 2024. Voting day in Venezuela. Lines wrap around blocks. Voters show up despite years of regime intimidation. And the opposition does something clever. They station volunteers at every single polling station. They photograph every single tally sheet. They build an independent record of the vote. The evidence is overwhelming. González didn't just win, he won by a landslide. Then midnight comes. The CNE, the National Electoral Council, declares Nicolas Maduro the winner. They provide no evidence, no tally sheets, no breakdown by polling station, just an announcement. One of the 5 CNE rectors goes into hiding rather than sign off on the result. He later confirms he saw no evidence of a Maduro victory. Protests erupt immediately. The regime responds with fury. Over 2,000 detained in the following weeks, sentences of up to 25 years for terrorism. González is forced to flee the country. He ends up in Madrid, a president-elect in exile. Machado goes underground. She appears at rallies, speaks to crowds, then vanishes before the security services arrive. 2025. Maria Corina Machado wins the Nobel Peace Prize. International validation for the woman the regime tried to erase. So you had a stolen election, witnessed by the entire world. You had a dictator with American narco-trafficking charges already waiting since 2020. You had the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. And you had a new American administration that saw an opportunity. The table was set. January 3rd, 2026. The domino falls and the details are still emerging, but here's what we know. U.S. Special Operations Forces entered Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro was extracted from his compound in Caracas. Within hours, he was on a plane to the United States. He's now in federal custody in New York, facing the narco-terrorism charges that have been waiting for him since 2020. The maximum sentence is life in prison. Donald Trump announced that American companies will develop Venezuelan oil during a transition period, the world's largest proven reserves, now under new management. 25 years of the Cuba-Venezuela alliance ended in one night. The shockwave spread immediately. Emergency ALBA Summit convenes. Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega declares his solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution, but he just lost his partner in gold laundering and sanctions evasion. Caribbean nations that spent 2 decades receiving discounted Venezuelan oil through Petrocaribe are scrambling to find alternatives. And in Havana, the question on everyone's mind, are we next? Rubio's warning wasn't subtle. If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit. Trump's statement was even more direct. Cuba is a failing nation right now. For the first time in 67 years, regime change in Cuba seems possible. So the alliance is dead, the lifeline is cut. The threat is explicit. The question every analyst, every diplomat, every Cuban is now asking: can Cuba survive this? The answer is more complicated than you might think, and more pessimistic. The first question everyone asks, won't China step in? Won't Russia? Let me show you why that's wishful thinking. Venezuela provided Cuba with something irreplaceable, ideologically subsidized oil, barter deals, no hard currency required, just send doctors, receive oil, a socialist gift economy. China doesn't operate that way. China provides loans, commercial terms, interest rates, repayment schedules. When Cuba can't pay, and they can't, China takes collateral, assets, control. That's not a lifeline, that's a loan shark. And here's how much faith China has in Cuba's economy. October 2024. Beijing suspended its annual purchase of 400,000 tons of Cuban sugar. Why? Because Cuba's harvest collapsed so badly they couldn't deliver. Total China-Cuba trade, roughly $645 million annually. That's less than 1% of Cuba's GDP. Venezuela provided 22%. What about Russia? Russia-Cuba trade runs about $450 million annually. 90% of that is Russian exports to Cuba, not the other way around. Yes, Russia sent some oil in 2025, about 100,000 metric tons, but that came as loans, not gifts. And Moscow has its hands full with Ukraine. They're not looking for another dependent state to subsidize. One analyst put it this way: Havana cannot count on a magic pill from either Moscow or Beijing. Neither great power wants to fully subsidize a failed economic model. They've seen what happened to the Soviet Union when it tried. Meanwhile, US policy is squeezing tighter. January 14, 2025. In his final days, Joe Biden made some concessions. He rescinded Cuba's state sponsor of terrorism designation. He suspended certain lawsuits. A Vatican-mediated deal released 553 political prisoners. January 20, 2025. Donald Trump's first day in office. He reversed everything. 6 days. That's how long Cuba's diplomatic opening lasted. Rubio reinstated the Cuba restricted list. They sanctioned Orbit SA, Cuba's main remittance processor. That threatens $4 billion in annual remittances. Money that 2/3 of Cuban families depend on. And here's the structural problem. The Helms-Burton Act of 1996 codified the embargo into federal law. No president can lift it unilaterally. It requires an act of Congress. Title III allows anyone with property confiscated by the Castro regime to sue any foreign company using that property. $6 billion in potential claims. That deters foreign investment even from countries that oppose the embargo. The legal architecture of isolation is built into American law. So what does the regime have left? Repression. July 2021. 152 political prisoners. November 2024, 1,148. That's a 655% increase. When the July 2021 protests erupted, the largest since 1959, the regime arrested over 1,400 people. Sentences of up to 25 years for sedition, more than 650 are still in prison. And then there's GAESA, the military's business conglomerate. They control an estimated 70% of Cuba's economy: hotels, retail, telecommunications, import-export. The Cuban military isn't just guarding the revolution, they're running a business empire. Reported cash reserves of $18 billion. If true, that's more than the entire government budget. The question isn't whether the military is loyal to the revolution. The question is whether they're loyal to their business empire. And what happens when those two things conflict? So the regime in Havana faces what game theorists call a trilemma. 3 options, all of them bad. Option 1, open the economy. Allow private enterprise. Let markets work. The problem? Every communist state that opened its economy eventually faced demands for political freedom. China manages it with a surveillance state. Cuba doesn't have that capacity. Open the economy and risk losing political control. Option 2, maintain the status quo. Keep the system closed, keep the party in charge. The problem? The current system is producing 20-hour blackouts, skipped meals, and a mass exodus. You cannot maintain stability when people are starving and fleeing. At some point, desperation overcomes fear. Option 3. Find a new patron. Replace Venezuela with someone else. The problem? We've covered this. China provides loans, Russia is distracted, neither wants to subsidize a failing model. There is no replacement Venezuela on the horizon. Open up and lose control. Stay closed and face starvation. Wait for help that isn't coming. That's not a choice. That's a trap. The fall of Caracas has triggered a countdown for Havana. An economic model built on subsidized oil and exported doctors has proven to be a house of cards. Every survival strategy from the 1990s has been exhausted. Neither Beijing nor Moscow will write the checks Caracas once did. The Castro regime survived the Soviet collapse, but that was a different Cuba. Younger, more ideologically committed, with survival strategies still untapped. Today's Cuba is older, poorer, connected to a world it cannot have, and hemorrhaging its population. The Food Monitor program wrote, "Hunger not only deteriorates bodies, it also breaks bonds, dissolves life projects, and erodes public trust in the state, its institutions, and the future. The real revolution isn't one of guns and manifestos. It's one of empty stomachs and dark nights. The Castro brothers survived the Soviets. Can their successors survive the laws of compound economic failure? If I lived in Havana, I'd be concerned. Is this the final chapter of the Cuban Revolution? I want to hear what you think. Drop your prediction in the comments. If this kind of deep dive economic analysis is what you come to YouTube for, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit the bell. You'll get notified when we cover what happens next. If you want to understand how Venezuela collapsed in the first place, or what happened when the Soviet Union fell, those videos are right here. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.